Sean, are we going to war?
No. I mean, the trouble is, it's a massive question, isn't it? And it's been brought into sharp focus by former President Trump, blaming President Biden for the escalations in the Middle East and the like, and this week threatening that we're on the brink of World War III. And although we get used to some of these inflammatory statements, I found it really odd that this past week I've been approached several times, particularly around the Sky campus where I spend a lot of time, people pulling me aside and genuinely asking me, are we going to war? Are we going to have to serve our country? So these flippant statements that get thrown around in the rhetoric of, this year the presidential elections are happening, and of course in the UK as well. The US politics, they throw a lot of spears around at the time, but it is causing concern. And if you match that to the statements from the British Army, the head of the British Army, there's been a rotation coming up of heads of the British Army, and of course all three services take the opportunity at times to make the case for why they need more money. And the US and the British Army has turned around and said we're too small. They've talked about having to start potentially conscription, all that sort of thing. That language has scared people in this country, and I think it's a really disturbing trend. And I think we'll get onto this we're going to use this as a bit of a theme, aren't we, in the future?
Yeah.
For me, I think I'm a pragmatist. We've only got so much money. We have the biggest overdraft in this country we've had in a generation. Interest rates have gone up. So we in this country have got to make choices.
So what worries me a bit is what you alluded to, which is the politics of it. War is a way to become famous. I doubt we'd have heard of Napoleon or Wellington. Maggie Thatcher, Princess with the Falklands, and what was his name? The first Gulf War, Schwarzkopf. There we are. Now, how did I pull a name out of thin air? Because it was a war and a big one. So that worries me slightly, that you're sort of helpless to the politics.
I think that's always a risk. My only experience of being inside the Ministry of Defence is that there are some pretty robust conversations that go on in the Ministry of Defence before a nation goes to war. There is I'm not an academic, but Clausewitz, one of the masters of war, always said that the people, the politicians and the military, there's always a tension between the three, because the people want to be protected. The politicians essentially are self-serving, and the military are the ones that pay in blood for wars. And that's why you have military coups every now and again, because they no longer trust their political masters, because political masters just start exploiting the use of the military. Now, I'm not suggesting for 1 minute in this country we're going to have a military coup, but there is a very healthy dynamic between the military and the politicians behind closed doors that will be very robust about exploring every possible other avenue for resolving something before you end up unleashing the dogs of war. And I'm not saying that would ever stop an egotist from going off and find war. But also the other side of this, I mean, let's be blunt as well. Sometimes the military, if you're not being used, the danger is you don't get funded. So, for example, at the moment, the Royal Air Force is pretty busy. It's running white hot at the moment, and therefore it's in the news and it attracts more funding. Whereas the British Army, I'm talking about big handfuls now. We got involved. The last big war was the war in Afghanistan. We got a bit of a bruising there. And does our nation have the appetite for putting large bodies of people on the ground in harm's way again on another on foreign soil?
Well, are we equipped properly for a major war? Our defence budget in terms of the size of the military force has reduced? Are we in fit shape to handle one?
I think we are, but it depends on what type of scenario it is. And the harsh reality of history shows that we're never prepared for the war that actually happens. Do we have a very professional, very well equipped, very capable series of military capabilities in this country? Yes, we do. Should we be proud of them? Yes, we should. Does that mean we're ready for conducting World War III? No, that doesn't, because defence is an insurance policy against an uncertain world. If you had to pay the premiums, have a full standing army, standing air force, standing navy ready for all eventualities, it would consume the whole of our GDP. And yet in this country, we need an NHS, we need to have a welfare state, we need to have all these other things. You and I are both taxpayers. There is a limit to how much money you can spend. So I think there's two debates here, one of which is how much money gets into defence. In Margaret Thatcher's day, it was 4% of GDP. Now it's 2%. And the second issue is where you spend that money, where are the priorities? We discussed earlier the carrier programme. It's easy to say with the benefit of hindsight, but we spent a lot of money in this country on something that we're not using the way it was designed to be used, and history will judge whether that was a wise way of spending a lot of money. And I think there are things that could be done to spend our money more wisely, particularly in the joint environment rather than individual services. It's still very much three stovepipes, yet you don't go to war like that. You go to war as a team.
Yeah, and as you say, we've got choices to make. We've got to run a country. All the services we provide peacetime, it's actually very expensive. And if you're not at peace, then you can funnel your money directly into your military program. I was doing some reading up on the Houthis the other day, and one of the questions I asked was, what is the size of their fighting force? Do you know what the answer was? It was at a minimum 25,000. At a maximum, it was 100,000. Now, our army is less than
80,000.
That's a lot of people in what we would have imagined was a ragbag bunch of thugs.
It is interesting, though. We could spend ages getting into this, and we're going to explore some of these later, aren't we, in different podcasts. But I would say that at the First World War and the Second World War, we were largely soldier-based, and we lost millions of people in those conflicts. And the lesson, I think, that we learned from the Western society was we never want to see those highly attritional battles again. So can you spend defence money in ways that allow you to win wars without paying such a huge price on the battlefield? And that's why we spent a lot of money on technology in jets, with fighter jets, with missiles, precision guided, with tanks, with anti-tank missiles, with the whole suite of capabilities that where you can wreak destruction at range rather than hand-to-hand fighting. I'm being, somewhat flippant for effect. A lot of capabilities like the Houthis they don't have a standing air force, standing army, standing navy. They don't have access to that sort of technology. So yes, the numbers look dramatic, but we've got to be careful not to assume that numbers translate to military capability.
Okay, sure. Well, maybe we pick this up in another podcast, because it would be interesting to look at what our allies have done in the last 20 odd years with their budgets, and therefore how ready they are for any sort of military-based conflict. And for instance, in Europe, different countries have handled it obviously differently. We were talking about Poland earlier. They pretty much doubled their defence budget, and with a growing economy as well. So as a percentage of GDP, it's getting to be a big number. They have sensed trouble on the horizon, and I think their 2023 budget for defence was 4% of GDP. That's a big number.
It is, which roughly what the US spends. But going back to your Houthi point, I think it'd be also interesting to explore that a bit more, because they may not have an established army, navy or air force, but they're causing havoc in the Red Sea, disrupting global trade. And despite the best efforts of a global superpower, in fact, the global superpower, hasn't stopped them.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, we were talking, weren't we, that one missile got through of the Houthis, and they reckon that put the price of bread up in America by 10 cents. America has a population of 330 million. Assume people have one loaf of bread a week. That's 330 million times 52. Divided by 10 for the 10 cents to turn it into dollars. You've got a lot of money. Billions on one product. Multiply that across the set of things people need on a day-to-day basis. That's a lot of money just taken out of the economy for one missile from a ragbag bunch of thugs.
One to explore.